Yusuf is from Gaza. And the title of this talk is something I got from his Facebook profile, Between Alienation and Exile, which is actually sums up the Palestinian experience of displacement. Yusuf Al-Jamal is a Palestinian refugee from Al-Nusayrat refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. He holds an MA from the Department of International and Strategic Studies at the University of Malaya. He got his PhD from the Middle East Institute at Sakarya University in Turkey. In addition to his research interests in the diaspora, security, and indigenous studies, Dr. Al-Jamal has been involved in a number of book projects, including translations of books on Palestinian prisoners, among them Dreaming of Freedom, Palestinian Child Prisoners Speak, and all those books you see in front, which we collaborated on. And there's a collection of stories about shared struggle of Palestinian and Irish hunger strikers as well. Dr. Al-Jamal has published a number of journal articles on topics that includes Palestinians in the diaspora, travel restrictions imposed on Palestinians, and struggles for liberation. Okay, Yusuf, the voice is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and Salamat Pagi, everyone. It's great to be back in Malaysia. You know, Malaysia has a very special place in my heart, and I'm always happy to be back. But I'm saddened that I am back this time during a genocide that is taking place against my people in Palestine and in Gaza in particular. Very often when we talk about Palestine and Palestinians, we are reduced into statistics and numbers, and this is very sad. So today I am here to share my personal story under incubation so that you relate to my experience as a human being, and to remember that all these statistics and numbers, all these people killed in Gaza, now more than 23,000 Palestinians, including those under the rubble, have been killed. They also have stories, they have dreams, they have aspirations. So I will give you a background into Gaza and refugees in Gaza, because I don't want to start from October 7. October 7 is just the last phase of 75-year-long saga of genocide, ethnic cleansing, murder, and killing against the Palestinian people, not just in Gaza, but all over Palestine. Gaza is a tiny geography. In historic Palestine, it's only 1.3% of what used to be Palestine before 1948. So my family and 70% of people in Gaza are refugees. They were made refugees in 1948 at gunpoint when Zionist militias attacked our village, killing my great-grandfather and forcing his kids into refugee camps in Gaza. What you know today, unfortunately, we do not have a map, but for those who know, and you can check online, the Gaza Strip, the greater Sirwazna, how are you? That's not you? Okay, you look like one of my classmates at UM. Okay, sorry. So the greater Gaza district used to be much bigger than what we know today as the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip today is only almost 140 miles. The greater Gaza district used to be much bigger than that. It had 34 villages and towns. And the majority of people who live in Gaza today, 70% of these people are descendants of Palestinian refugees who were made refugees at gunpoint. Their towns and villages were ethnically cleansed in 1948 when Zionist militias invaded their homes. So what's happening in Gaza today is a continuation of what Palestinians describe as Nakba, the catastrophe, the events that befell the Palestinian people in 1948. We have to look at it from this perspective. Settler colonialism, forcing Palestinians, the natives of the land, out by any means necessary, as you've seen what happened in Gaza recently and still happening, so that settlers, mostly European settlers, could come and live in their place. Um, so in 1948, my great grandfather was killed. Three of his children survived and they made it to Gaza. They became refugees in Gaza. They lived in different refugee camps, and the majority of my family live in Nusayrat refugee camp. And Nusayrat is a home for almost 120,000 refugees. And it's one of 8 refugee camps in Gaza. So this is Gaza. So some people ended up in Gaza because Gaza was closer to them, if you look at the map. And they were internally displaced in Palestine. So when we talk about Gaza, we should remember that 70% of people there are refugees. This is context, important context. Some people ended up in the West Bank, like my mother's family. So my parents come from the same extended family. Our family was split into half. My mother's side of the family ended up in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Jericho. The Palestinians who ended up in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, some ended up in Egypt. So our family from day one was split into two because of the creation of Israel. They became refugees in their own country, displaced, internally displaced. They were never allowed to go back to their towns and villages, although there is a UN resolution 194. That was one of the conditions for the creation of Israel is to implement the right of return of Palestinian people, resolution 194. But Israel never did that. These refugees live in miserable conditions, abject poverty, literally in some cases across the border from what used to be their towns and villages. Many of these refugees owned land, they were wealthy, they were educated, and all of a sudden they lost everything and they became refugees in their own country or elsewhere in other countries. So this context is very important for people to understand that what's happening in Gaza and Palestine did not start on October 7. It started in 1947 and 1948 when these refugees were forced at gunpoint to leave their towns and villages. 15,000 Palestinians were killed in 1948, and this is a very big number at the time. Almost 1% of the population were killed. Many horrible massacres took place against, as you see what's happening in just yesterday, Israel dropped a number of bombs on Shuja'iyya neighborhood, killing, some people say, 1,000 people. They destroyed 50 houses at the same time. Many of these houses are overpopulated because there are a lot of people who are internally displaced. So this war has targeted Palestinians as a nation, regardless of who they are. Muslims, Christians, and Jews have always coexisted in Palestine. They lived in peace. In Gaza, there was a Jewish neighborhood up until 1948. And 3% of the population of Palestine were Jews. So as Palestinians, we do not have a problem with anyone. It's not a religious war. You shouldn't never think of it as a religious war. There is a chance that my family were Christian, pagan, and Jewish at some point in their life, and they converted to different religions because Palestine has always been a land for the 3 Abrahamic religions. And I can tell you more about the history, the Jewish history of Gaza, the Christian history of Gaza, the pagan history of Gaza later on. But this is an introduction. It's rare that we get to talk about Gaza from this perspective. In 1967, so for 20 years, almost 19 years, from 1948 up until 1967, my family was split into two. They were not able to physically meet because for them to be able to meet, they had to travel from from the West Bank to Jordan to Egypt or vice versa, and then come to Gaza. Israel was in between. Today, when we talk about division in Palestine, political division among Palestinian factions, we should always remember that there is a geographic division created by Israel. Israel is in between Palestinians. So it's a geopolitical division. I mean, many countries have divisions, ethnic, religious, social, economic, but it's very visible in Palestine because there is a geographic division. We were reunited, ironically, under occupation. In 1967, my extended family was able to physically meet again after 19 years under Israel's occupation. When Israel occupied the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai. They were ironically reunited under military occupation. And this lasted up until 1993, when the Oslo Accords between the Palestine Liberation Organization and Israel were signed. Israel created a regime of permits that allow Palestinians to move, but under restrictions, and there were different procedures for them to obtain permits. In 1978, my parents, again under Israel's occupation, were able to meet, and they got married. So my mother comes from the West Bank city of Bethlehem, and she moved to Gaza. Like, imagine as a Malaysian, you move from, let's say, Penang to KL, you change your address. Once you change your address, it doesn't impact you as a citizen of the country. The reason you change your address, probably because you want to get the mail in a different location. But in Palestine, once you change your address, it impacts your life forever. So we have different types of IDs. Palestinians in Jerusalem have the blue ID, and each ID you have, it's apartheid 101. It impacts your status, your privileges, your ability to move, your ability to travel, your access to healthcare, the kind of courts you're brought to, if you commit, anything like.
I met a PhD student in Sydney, and she was from Jerusalem, and she mentioned that she was afraid she'd lose her ID.
Yes.
As a Jerusalemite.
So in Jerusalem, Israel is not interested in Palestinians, and they want to push them out. They did not give them citizenship, and Palestinians there have what we call the blue ID, and it could be withdrawn anytime. There are thousands of, bureaucratic reasons. One of them is a policy called Center of Life. So if you study in Sydney for a few years, they will say, oh, your center of life is not Jerusalem, so you are not entitled to this ID. But Israeli citizens who have, Israeli nationalities, even if they go on a mission to Mars, they will still retain their IDs. They never lose them. But for Palestinians, your center of life, you move to the West Bank, you move to Gaza, then you lose your ID, especially if you're from Jerusalem.
There are many stories of couples as well,
yes.
Jerusalem and West Bank.
Yeah, so if you're married to a Palestinian in a next town in Ramallah, or just outside the wall, so Israel built a wall that separates the West Bank from Jerusalem, you will probably lose your ID. My cousin is married to a Jerusalemite. He's from Jericho, and now he has to apply for a permit so that he could live with his wife in Jerusalem. Otherwise, if she moves to Jerusalem, then she might lose her ID because center of life has changed to another Palestinian city. This doesn't apply to Israeli Jews, of course. It only applies to Palestinians. And then you have the West Bank ID. My mom had a West Bank ID, but once, in the West Bank, we have military occupation, checkpoints, Israeli settlers attacking Palestinian towns, uprooting trees, killing Palestinians, abducting children, and burning them alive. This is what's happening in the West Bank by Israeli settlers who are armed to the teeth. The policy of the state now is to arm Israeli settlers. They're not civilians. and they live there in contradiction with the international law.
I saw this Ben Giver. He was handing out rifles to settlers
Yes,
a couple of weeks back.
yes. So this is the Israeli in
Police minister.
yeah, like Minister of Interior, Homeland Security, basically. And he's himself a very radical settler. And he keeps breaking into Al-Aqsa Mosque from time to time. So this is the kind of government we have in Israel. So this is the West Bank ID. Once you change your address to Gaza, I mean, if you change your address to Jerusalem, you never get the Jerusalem ID. But if you change your address to Gaza, they love it. They will withdraw your ID, whether you're from Jerusalem or the West Bank, because they want less Palestinians in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem.
You know, the prisoners were all exiled to Gaza. We did 3 books on Palestinian prisoners, and I noticed that when they were released from prison in the prison exchange, hostage exchange, they were all sent to Gaza in exile.
Yeah. So they're not interested in Palestinians in the West Bank. They want to push, I mean, they are interested in them in the sense that they want to push them to Gaza. But if Palestinians in Gaza want to move to the West Bank, it's easier to move to the US than moving to the West Bank or visiting the West Bank. So for my mom, once she changed her address to Gaza, she lost her West Bank ID, although she grew up there and she has family there. Her parents, her siblings, everyone in her extended family live in the West Bank. And in order to be able to visit the West Bank, she needed to apply for an Israeli permit, And it took her 12 years, from 2000 to 2012, to get an Israeli permit. And during this time, she lost her parents. In 2003, her father passed away. In 2008, her mother passed away, and she was never given a permit to participate in the funeral procession, which is an hour away from Gaza. So, you know, people have to understand our life under occupation before October 7, under siege, for 75 years, fragmentation and slow death. What happened today is that we moved from slow death to immediate death. But we always lived under death and a threat of losing our life, our jobs, our houses. And even in 2012, it was not easy for my mom. She applied for a permit to visit her family. Her permit was rejected, and it takes long time and bureaucratic procedures, including for patients who cannot get treatment in Gaza and want to travel to the West Bank for treatment. Her application was rejected, and we had to go through an Israeli human rights organization called Gisha, which helped Palestinians with movement between Gaza and the West Bank. And they had to go to the Israeli Supreme Court to apply for a permit on her behalf. Imagine, like, the Israeli Supreme Court intervening in such a case. So for my mom to get a permit, and they gave her a 4-day permit, although it's been 12 years, she hasn't seen her family, but she overstayed. She stayed there for like 32 days, a day for each year. She lived in Gaza, away from her family. This also applies for patients. So in 2007, my eldest sister, she was 26 years old, and she needed a permit to have a minor surgery, which was not available in Gaza, again, due to the siege. So the health infrastructure, even, I'm not talking about now, there is no infrastructure in the first place. Israel shut down every single hospital in the north of Gaza, and the remaining hospitals in the south of Gaza are almost on the verge of, they have collapsed. I wouldn't say on the verge of collapse. They have collapsed. They're operating on 200% of their original capacity. So the situation is very catastrophic. But before that, even minor surgeries were not available in Gaza, like replacing a mesh in her gallbladder. It takes 10 minutes. It was not available. She needed this surgery, but then we wouldn't get this surgery done in Gaza, and she needed to apply for an Israeli permit, and she was at the hospital. She kept waiting for a week, and then she got a rejection. Again, the same reason, security threat. And the Rafah crossing with Egypt was also shut down. So she kept waiting, and the moment she was able to leave Gaza, it was too late. Once she arrived in Cairo, she had the surgery, and the next day she lost her life. And she was newly married. I mean, these stories are not unique to my family. There are hundreds of patients who lost their lives because Israel wouldn't give them a permit to have a surgery. And this also applies to cancer patients. So, a minor surgery is not available in Gaza. What about cancer, treatment? Recently we had some advancement, but people still needed to travel to have chemotherapy sessions in Jerusalem at Augusta Victoria Hospital, which was built by the Germans back in the days. And they needed an Israeli permit. The Turkish hospital, Friendship Hospital in Gaza, was the only hospital that provided some cancer, not all. So if you want to travel for the first time, you have to travel through Israel. But later on, maybe the follow-up will be at the hospital. Israel destroyed the third floor of this hospital during this aggression. And many of these cancer patients had to be evacuated to Turkey. But before that, people would travel to Jerusalem for the first chemotherapy session. I mean, all chemotherapy sessions should be done in Jerusalem, but the follow-up could be done in Gaza. And people apply for permits. And then Israel, it's a regime of torture, this permit regime of torture. They would sometimes 19% of people would get the permits late. And as a cancer patient, you cannot wait. It's death. So a lot of people lost their lives. And in some cases, Israel would give them a permit to have the first chemotherapy session, but not the second one. And then they would blackmail them to collaborate against their people to get a second permit. And hundreds of cancer patients lost their lives waiting for Israeli permits. So this is a common practice. This was before October 7th.
Actually, one thing I was shocked to discover was that to get permits to travel, especially if your family, your children were sick, Israelis would use this opportunity to make you become spies for them.
Yes, so they know all details about Gaza. They have control over the civic records, and sometimes they would invite people for interviews before giving them a permit, and they would blackmail them. You need treatment. You're a cancer patient, and you have to collaborate with us. You have to give us information. Otherwise, you would never get this permit. And a lot of people choose to die in Gaza over collaboration with Israel. So that's why we have hundreds of people who lose their lives. And this is like a slow war. So, and humiliation is multi-generational. So this has been happening to us as a nation since 1948. So my great-grandfather was killed. My grandparents suffered under, these restrictions. My parents suffered under these restrictions, and now it's like my generation. And then, like, if this doesn't stop, then the future generations will also suffer.
One of the first stories I read that Yusuf had written, I saw in Gaza Writes Back. It was called "Why I Have Two Brothers Called Omar," and the story, well, you can tell the story, was about his older brother who had been killed, and his parents had named as the younger brother after him. We can tell.
So, we have a lot of people in Palestine because, losing a family member is common. So to make sure that they honor the dead, that they rename their kids in the future after people who get killed by Israel. And this doesn't, it's not limited to families, like direct family members. I know how many, like our neighbor, for example, was named after my brother. So our neighbors did that. Yes. My cousin, my youngest brother, when he was born, my parents decided to give him the name of my eldest brother, who was 17. And before Israel left Gaza, so they left the inside of Gaza, but they never left Gaza. So they have full control over Gaza. And you've seen this during this aggression, where they were able to shut down the internet, electricity, fuel, what else? Telecommunication services in one click. So they have a full control over Gaza. Surveillance, warships from the sea. People cannot fish beyond 3 nautical miles. But when they were physically in Gaza, they had 22 settlements, colonies. They divided Gaza into three, and you will see this in a few days. The Gaza Strip will be divided into three. Israel is going back to these settlements, sending their troops. And people had to go through checkpoints when Israel was in Gaza up until 2005. They would also carry out invasions into refugee camps from time to time. So in 2004, I was, I think, 14, 13. They invaded our refugee camp and they killed 13 or 14 Palestinians, including my brother. They had like snipers occupying Palestinian houses and taking their residents as hostages to be like human shields, and then they would snipe people and kill people.
I thought it was very inhumane as well when you wrote about how when Omar was shot and nobody was allowed to save him and put him in the ambulance, they would shoot people trying to rescue him.
Because this is the purpose, you know, they want to kill as many Palestinians as they could. And so he was shot and he bled, I think, for 4 hours. And every paramedic who were very close to him, who tried to get to rescue him, were also shot. And his friend then lost hope and he tried to rescue him. So he crawled on the ground. When there, he was shot and critically injured, but he survived by a miracle. What happened during this aggression? He was also killed. I mean, these are not unique stories. Every single, as I said, every single Palestinian in Gaza in particular have similar stories. During this aggression, my timeline has turned into a graveyard, literally. I don't want to refresh my Facebook timeline because every time I see pictures of people who I know firsthand, my friends who went to school with me, my childhood friend Salah Salhi was killed. And just these are the people who come to my mind right now when I try to remember, but it's much more than that. My primary school friend Hassan Najjar was killed with his family. Ra'ad Qaddura, who went to he obtained his PhD from UQM. He was killed, who co-translated the Prisoner's Diaries. He was killed along with 53 members of his family, and including his newly born twins, and all his children, 4 children, were killed with him, his parents, his siblings, nephews, nieces. So what's happening in Gaza today is a genocide, literally a genocide, because targeting people like entire residential areas, killing hundreds of people in a single airstrike is a genocide. Pushing people out of their homes is a genocide. Targeting water, solar panels. As I said, residential areas, buildings, entire buildings are leveled, not just buildings, neighborhoods are leveled to the ground. 60% of houses were destroyed in Gaza. Even if Palestinians survive this genocide, 60% of Palestinians in Gaza will be homeless. And, you know, Israel's plan to depopulate Gaza is not new. So since Israel captured Gaza in 1967, they have always tried in many different ways to push people out. In fact, an Israeli prime minister, was it Shamir, who said, I wish that one day I wake up and I find that Gaza was swallowed by the sea. So this is how they view Gaza. One time on an Israeli radio program, they were discussing what to do with Gaza, and an Israeli called in and he said, the best idea is to turn Gaza into the biggest parking lot. See, the genocide, the genocidal mentality. 2.3 million people live in Gaza. In 1948, overnight, 200,000 Palestinians ended up in Gaza. There were another 100,000 living in Gaza already, 300,000. The population of Gaza today is 2.3 million. Looking at them like this is like turning Gaza into a parking lot. This is settler colonialism, because you do not see these people as humans. What Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, said at the beginning of this genocide, that Palestinians in Gaza, they're not civilians in Gaza. We are going to shut down fuel, internet, and telecommunication services. No water for Gaza, he said. No food for Gaza. These are human animals, he said. I mean, the discourse is very scary, but it's not surprising for Palestinians. We have lived through this throughout many generations. It's somehow surprising to some people who realized, this is happening to Palestinians after 75 years. But it's not surprising for us. And even if you have an animal, a pet, you wouldn't starve them to death. So Israel is treating Palestinians in Gaza worse than animals. As my friend Baha El-Hilo said, Israel redefined savagery. But again, targeting, as I said, water trucks, bakeries. Israel made sure that anything that sustains Palestinians, keeps them alive, is targeted. And despite the destruction, 700,000 Palestinians remain in northern Gaza, in Gaza City and the north. So when we talk about the north today, it's not empty.
How do you think they live then? 700,000 people, but not a drop of.
There are serious complaints about lack of food and water. But Palestinians do not want to become refugees again. I grew up in a refugee camp. 70% of the population of Gaza became refugees. 30% of the population of the West Bank became refugees in 1948. So we do not want to become refugees again. We prefer to die on our land rather than becoming refugees again. In fact, when Egypt opened the Rafah crossing for Palestinians stuck in Egypt, 250 Palestinians decided to go back to Gaza. Although it's a death sentence for them, there is no food, there is no water, and Israel is bombing everywhere, but they decided to go back so that they die with their own people rather than watching them being killed from afar. How do people survive? We have a huge sense of community. I'm sad to say that we're used to this. I mean, if this happens in another country that never experienced war, then everyone will be running away, probably. But for us, we do not want to become refugees, and we find creative ways to survive. But at the end of the day, if people outside, if governments outside do not intervene, we're not what's the word to say it? We're not superhumans. We will run out of food. In fact, we ran out of food. My mom told me that they were able to get 2 stacks of flour recently, but this will sustain them for 2 weeks only. They were lucky to get it. Yeah. But then there are a lot of people who were internally displaced in the south itself and in the north itself. So each house, that's why when Israel bombs, dozens of people die. Each house, when 60% of houses are destroyed, then people seek refuge in their friends' houses, other extended, family members' houses, and houses are overcrowded. So in a single house, you have 60 people, 70 people, and they need food.
Actually, a few days before Riot was killed, our friend Riot, he told me that his house had 100 people because all family members had come from other areas which had been bombed. So his house was full of family members. There was 100 of them. Therefore, when the missile struck his house, it was 2 missiles. 53 people were killed immediately. His wife survived, but she had burns all over the body, 2nd and 3rd degree burns. And she herself lost the twins she gave birth to 2 weeks before that by cesarean without anesthesia. So she had gone through all that pain and suffering, and 2 weeks later, her twins were killed together with her husband and 2 other children.
Yeah. I mean, it's sad to say that hearing in news such, it's horrible. But because the amount of death, dehumanization is huge, that like now when I hear the news, like when I refresh my timeline and I see a picture of someone I know very well who was killed, which is common every day, it doesn't impact me. Not because I lost my feelings or my ability to feel sorry for my people. It's because the amount of death has surpassed my capacity as a human being to be impacted. I just feel like null, you know, it doesn't impact me. But again, to go back to the conversation about like, and you know, this is important in a Malaysian context for people to understand that this is not a religious war. Why? Israel has killed 19 Palestinian Christians at least. They bombed their church, the third oldest church in the world. People get surprised. I mean, Jesus was born in Palestine. And they're unfortunately Christians, Zionist Christians, who support Israel, but they never support Palestinian Christians. You never understand how politics work here. If we want to talk about, you know, a religious point of view, let alone talking about humanitarian point of view. Even, you know, American Jews now, a lot of American Jews, especially young American Jews, they're protesting Israel's brutality. They do not want these crimes to be committed in their names. And we do not shy away from our history. We have a pagan history, we have a Jewish history, we have Christian history, and we have a Muslim history. Gaza has been very stubborn over the years. I mean, it's very sad, but I also like to share, you know, history and culture and sometimes joke, because we have to joke to survive. If you cannot change your life, mock it. This is the motto. And this is a way of healing for us. The fact that we are able to mock our occupation is resistance. And you see this spokesperson for the Israeli army, like all these memes about him showing, oh, this is a tunnel here. And people are making fun of them because they lost credibility. They cannot, they're showing a calendar timetable of names of the week, like weekdays, like Isnin, Silasa, Sabtu. And he says, Khamis, is it in Malay? He says Khamis is a name of a guy, a military commander. I mean, Friday is a military commander in English too. So, in a way, we won the PR war. This is good, but we need to translate this huge solidarity into political action on the ground, because our people, there is a genocide. We're proud of their steadfastness, but we are not superheroes. I told you, we have to provide. Even when during this 7-day ceasefire, whatever humanitarian pause they call it, which was done to rescue Israeli civilian hostages in Gaza, it was not done for the sake of Palestinians. My family never got any aid, although they live in the south. But just to go back a little bit in time and to talk about the history of Gaza and why this is not a religious war. So Gaza was pagan, and during the olive harvest, which is very important in Palestine, in Gaza, to mark the start of the olive harvest, people say the cross has materialized in Arabic, which has a very interesting story. And then they pick up their olives. The cross has materialized, Salla bis-Salib. And the majority of Gaza's population are Muslims. There are over 3,000 to 5,000 Palestinian Christians in Gaza. And this is a very Christian saying. And there's a very interesting story about it, that when Gaza has been very stubborn over the years. In fact, the symbol of Gaza municipality is the phoenix, which is a bird that lived in Arabia for hundreds of years, and it's a symbol of rising from ashes. So Gaza has been very stubborn, and Gaza has always risen from ashes over the years. It was destroyed many times because many battles took place in Gaza over the years, and Palestine was invaded by different empires. And the word Gaza in Arabic, it comes from Gaza, Ghazwa, which is invasion, battlefield, battle. So we're very used to battles, unfortunately. And so Gaza was the last Palestinian city to convert to Christianity when Palestine became Christian. And this is oral history. It could be right, it could be wrong, but it's interesting to share. And a priest came to Gaza and he invited people to Christianity. So they told him, he said, look at all these trees, they're dry. You have to believe in Christianity for the rain to fall down and for these trees to get some water, rainwater. So people told him, okay, go, yalla, ijri. Go and pray to God. If it rains, we'll believe in Christianity. So he went and he prayed and it rained and they believed in Christianity and they said the cross has materialized, which means the priest was right and they believed in Christianity. So they did not believe in Christianity easily, but they had to like play around.
Yeah, to prove it.
Yes. And that's why people still connect the olive harvest when it rains for the first time. It's not like Malaysia, it's raining 24/7. We have 4 seasons. So it rains in mid-September, early October every year. That's the start of the rain season or the fall in Gaza. And people say the cross has materialized. And once it rains, they pick up their olives. So understanding history is also important. When Alexander the Great tried to conquer Gaza, he conquered many great cities across the globe, and some of them were named after him, including Alexandria in Egypt. When he came to Gaza, he failed to conquer Gaza twice. He lost his leg on the way, and on the third time, he was able to conquer Gaza and he burned Gaza. So, people of Gaza, the moral of the story is they're very stubborn, they do not give up easily. I want you to remember Gaza as such.
And
there are a lot of
rising from the
yes,
ashes as well.
there are a lot of educated people in Gaza. Thousands of PhD holders. It's one of the highest in the world. Literacy rate is 98.5%. So we do not, even though we are victims of settler colonialism, we don't want you to remember us victims. It's not a humanitarian aid case. It's a political question. It's a question of Palestinian refugees. We do not want aid. If Gaza is open to the world and Palestine is free, we can in fact contribute to the world. Palestinians have built or contributed to building many countries in the Middle East with their knowledge, with their skills, and with their manpower and women power too. And again, so Alexander the Great, and when the British came, Allied forces, and it's very ironic because they also brought different people, including Muslims and non-Muslims, to fight with them from India and elsewhere, from Egypt and from Anzac, Australia and New Zealand. They brought indigenous people. So there is a British, what you call a British graveyard. It's funny because it's one of the greenest areas in Gaza. It's well maintained, has beautiful trees, and you can read the names of soldiers. Thousands of soldiers were killed when they tried to capture Gaza. There were 2 battles, they lost them, and thousands of soldiers were killed, including indigenous people, the Maori people from New Zealand. They're known for fighting. They brought them to fight Palestinians in Gaza, bringing indigenous people to fight indigenous people for the sake of colonialism. And the third time, they captured Gaza by deception. Another story. But again, the moral of the story, Gaza doesn't give up. And Palestinians do not give up. Why? Because we feel we are on the right side of history. In the book, we talk about Ireland and Palestine. But there are also many other examples of people who were subjected to oppression using different excuses. Settler colonialism always finds a narrative to justify its existence. And it always looks down at indigenous people and natives, calling them savages. I mean, if what Israel is doing in Gaza is not the new definition of savagism or being savage, it's like, but just yesterday, 50 houses were completely destroyed and almost 1,000 Palestinians were killed. This is not reported again. But we should remember Palestinians as people, as Ra'id, PhD holders who are trying to survive. But again, we have to act. We're not superheroes. We're famous for chili. We're stubborn. But again, we are human beings. And our ability to survive and thrive is limited, especially that starvation is taking place in Gaza now. Food was cut off. Water was cut off. Electricity was cut off. And it's been 2 months now. How long will we survive is a question for people to answer. There are a lot of things that could be done. There are countries that has diplomatic ties with Israel, countries that do not. But every single one of us, every single country can do something to stop the genocide, which, again, I will stop here, is a continuation of the Nakba, the catastrophe that befell the Palestinian people in 1948.
Just maybe just some extra info. How I met Yusuf was on 2012 when I got some interviews of prisoners who had been released. In fact, in 2011, 1,027 Palestinian prisoners, but we can call them hostages as well now, were exchanged for one Israeli soldier who had been caught by Hamas and kept how long? 6 years in
Yes.
Gaza. I think Israel had tried to find him for many years and they couldn't. In the end, they agreed to a hostage exchange. And so prisoners who were released, many of them were exiled to Gaza, as we mentioned earlier. And they had all these stories because they were interviewed by young journalists. So when they sent me these interviews, Yusuf and Raed were the ones who had translated these interviews into English for me so that, we could compile it into this book. And so basically, actually, the reason for the October 7 attack on Gaza, presumably, was because the Palestinians wanted to get the hostages back. Because at that time, there were almost 5,000 prisoners in Israeli prisons. Many were children, many are children, women as well. So in this exchange, it allowed some prisoners to be released.
So just to give you a background into imprisonment in Palestine, imprisonment is one of the main tools used by settler colonialism throughout history to control people, because settler colonialism is about displacement and control. My grandfather from my mother's side was in Israeli jails for 6 years. He was sentenced to life, but because of his role in the society, he was what we call like a peacemaker. He had influence over people. So the military governor reduced his sentence to 6 years. So he was in jail from 1972 to 1978. Over 1 million Palestinians, and we are a small nation in number, were arrested by Israel since 1967. The longest serving political prisoner in the world is a Palestinian, Nail al-Barghouti, whose story is in the book.
Yeah.
He served 44 years in Israeli jails. There are hundreds of Palestinians who spend more than 25 years in Israeli jails. This is normal. No one talks about Palestinians in Israeli jails. Today, you've never heard of them before. You only started to hear about them a little bit when Israeli hostages were taken. So a main reason why, in my point of view, October 7 happened is because of the issue of Palestinian prisoners.
So in the book, we have a picture of Nail Barghouti getting married after 33 years in prison to the lady who had waited for him all this time.
Yes, so he was released in 2011 as part of the prisoner swap deal, but he was rearrested again in 2012 or 13. And even when he was released, he was not allowed to leave his village. He's now in jail again, and this is a very important issue for Palestinian prisoners. It's not just adults, women, men. At any given time, there are 6,000, 7,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails throughout history. Now the number has risen to 9,000, 10,000. Since October 7, 3,200 or 300 Palestinians were arrested by Israel.
The irony is that when they released the prisoners lately, they also captured back an equal amount of prisoners.
Yes. So they released 150, 180, and they captured 2,000 and 300, 3,000. We even lost number. I cannot remember. It's 2,300, 2,300. Yeah, 3,290 prisoners, and it impacts every single Palestinian. As I said, the different stories to talk about prisoners. The child prisoners, as young as 5 and 6 years old. We have many stories of child prisoners here, 24 stories of children who were captured by Israel and they served 5 years, 3 years, 2 years in Israeli jails. And I will just tell you the story of Ayman Abbasi. So we interviewed him for the book, but he did not survive. He was released in 2015. He was killed by Israeli soldiers. Ahmad Manasra, he has been in Israeli jails since 2015.
Yes, Ayman Abbasi. When he was released, since he was shot dead.
Yeah.
Before the book was published.
Yeah, so he was killed before the book was published. And there are multiple stories. So child prisoners, women prisoners, there are women who give birth in Israeli jails. No one talks about them. Their numbers, they're never mentioned. They're terrorists. There are people, like entire families, who meet each other for the first time in Israeli jails. Because we're very thankful to colonialism. When they arrest people from the same family, they put them in the same cell. It's like stealing your bread and giving you a piece and asking you to be thankful. And then there are people who go on hunger strike. So we have something called administrative detention, which is a British law that was brought to Palestine in 1936. And it has been used by Israel since 1948. So a lot of these laws are British laws too, which were applied in other parts of the world, in India, Pakistan, Northern Ireland. And according to this law, Israel can arrest Palestinians without charge or trial. So if you are arrested in Israel under this law, you do not know why you're arrested or how long you will be in jail.
So the hunger striker Khadir Adnan was one case like that.
Yes.
So he went on a hunger strike and he died.
Yeah, so a lot of people go on hunger strike, both mass hunger strikes or individual hunger strikes. And these are stories of individual hunger strikers who go on a hunger strike so that Israel sentences them because they do not know their sentence. In fact, there is a prisoner who spent 15 years in Israeli jails without being charged under administrative detention. It's renewed every 3 or 6 months. So there are hunger strikers who go on hunger strike so that Israel ends their administrative detention and sentences them or releases them. One of them is Khadr Adnan. 4 people in this book lost their lives since they were released. Ayman Abbasi lost his life, a child prisoner, and Khadr Adnan in this book lost his life on a hunger strike. So he went on multiple hunger strikes. He would be released eventually, but last time in May, he went on an 88-day long hunger strike, and he did not make it. Just like Bobby Sands in Northern Ireland. But the way, international media dealt with the issue, and we see this happening in the way they deal with Ukraine, for example, and the way I'm not saying Russia is an angel. This is another issue, but the hypocrisy of Western media. He was rarely mentioned, and if he was ever mentioned, the discourse around him was very negative, and he lost his life. And Baha knows him in person. In fact, he went to school with him. So what do the Palestinians do? Even before Gaza has been under siege, brutal siege, for 17 years. In 2018, Palestinians staged the Great March of Return.
Peaceful, non-violent
protest. What Israel did at the borders of Gaza, they killed 300 Palestinians. Only 300.
And wounded 20,000 and made
Yes.
them disabled.
So what do? We want our freedom. We want to be treated equally. We've been calling for even one state solution. We're ready to live with our oppressors if we are granted equal rights. Of course, they don't want that. The equal rights is a threat to them because they will lose their privileges. So what do? I don't know.
Okay, so on that note, any questions?
Zionist regime. I don't want to call that this way. So what is the best thing we can do? Because there are many aid goods we try to bring. We don't know which ones get through. Although alhamdulillah, because I know Malaysian who lived in Gaza. I think you all know Nadir, and also I know his mother. So but there are so many we don't know which ones to support. And apart from that, what do we do? Really?
So, as I said, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is there, but our issue is not humanitarian per se. It's a political issue. Even if we rebuild Gaza now, Israel will come back and destroy Gaza again. And if we allow this approach to dominate our thinking, we will be, in fact, rewarding Israel, because every time Israel destroys Gaza, the reconstruction of Gaza will go through Israel and they will make profit. Again, Israel will make profit out of destroying Gaza and rebuilding Gaza again. What we need is political action. I'm not saying that do not donate to humanitarian NGOs. If you know, like, trusted NGOs, or if you know people directly on the ground. I've been trying to send money to poor families in Gaza. Sending money now is not an option in the first place, like through Western Union and all these, because Gaza was destroyed completely. If you know, like, trusted people, then yes, but it's not a humanitarian question, it's a political question. We have to act on a political level. Malaysia doesn't have ties with Israel, true, but also Malaysia can take Israel to the ICC. This is one thing that could be done. So we should, like, speak to our, I don't know how it works, but you can speak to your MPs who represent you in the parliament, or officials, call them and say, take Israel to the ICC. This is one. Two, invest in education. I think our weapon now is education. Israel destroyed many educational institutions, including Azhar University that Mustafa went to, and the Islamic University that I went to. Investing in education will make sure that it's a long-term investment, and it makes sure that Palestinians can survive and thrive and have the tools to tell their story, because it's a war of narrative.
Yeah.
An ignorant nation will not be able to defeat the occupation, but an educated nation will. So invest in education. There's a Malaysian school in my refugee camp called the Malaysian School, which was bombed by Israel. So invest in education. If you know people on the ground, people lost everything. Believe me, I'm not saying giving them some food is a bad idea, but it will not count much if we do not look for a political question. And of course, there are companies that are directly complicit in the occupation of Palestine, Israeli and international companies, such as HP Resolutions, which provides the Israeli Navy an army with software to racially profile Palestinians at checkpoints and maintain the siege of Gaza. So make sure that you boycott them and boycott other companies that directly invest in Israel's occupation of Palestine.
You can find the list on the BDS website.
Yes, so there is BDS Malaysia. There is also a website for the BDS Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, which is a Palestinian-led coalition of NGOs. There are different ways. I said, if you are in a union, make sure that your union doesn't invest in these companies. If you are at a church, make sure that your church doesn't subscribe to services or a mosque to run by these companies, such as HP, Caterpillar, Puma, Starbucks, etc.
Okay. Any more questions?
Question, because you are a real Gazan person.
Am I? Okay, thank you.
So, is the nerve actually exist? Like, is it for smuggling food and daily, or have you actually been to those tunnels?
Okay,
What is your view on the tunnel?
I've never seen a tunnel in my life, but based on reports and based on the witnesses of other people, I will talk about the commercial tunnels because I have no knowledge whatsoever, and 99% of Palestinians in Gaza have no knowledge of the other city underground in Gaza. There is another city, they say underground, but they're secret tunnels. Otherwise, if they're not secret, then Israel would destroy them the next day. So people involved in resistance in Gaza know of these tunnels, but normal people on the street do not. I will talk about commercial tunnels. So these are tunnels that connected Gaza with Egypt. There were 1,200 tunnels, 1,200 from
Started in what year? 2005?
2000 and so they started before, but they were in a limited number, even in the 80s. So to give you a context, Israel, as I said, Israel always tried to depopulate Gaza. In 1967, there was a plan. In 1969, there was also another plan to send young people on a one-way ticket to Latin America by deceiving them that they will get, jobs that pay as much as $3,000. At the time, it was a huge amount of money. In 1971, Ariel Sharon, Israel's former prime minister and one of the founders of the state of Israel, who has a lot of Palestinian blood on his hands, he displaced 12,000 Palestinians from Gaza to the Sinai. So a lot of these people lived in Rafah, the Egyptian side of Rafah city. So Rafah city is where all these tunnels, commercial tunnels, existed. And so because there were families, extended families on both sides of the border, they dug tunnels to smuggle food, drugs, gold, money, and people. Okay, so this is how it started in the 1980s. And then when the siege was imposed on Gaza in 2006, 2007, Palestinians started digging tunnels, commercial tunnels, to smuggle food into Gaza. 15, almost from 200, 1,200 to 1,500 tunnels.
That's because Israel restricted the kind of food.
Yes.
that-
So Israel had a policy. They wanted to, keep Palestinians alive, but not make them feel like full, like calculating the calories, basically. It's real, it's there, that Palestinians should not get more than 200 calories a day. So that
How much? I think 1,500 calories or something like that.
you can go back to, yeah, it's online,
So,
okay? So that they do not die, but they also do not get fat.
diet.
Yeah, they kept us on diet. Yeah. So Palestinians started smuggling everything you imagine: food, gas, animals, tigers, cars, gas. People who were separated, they were not. So only Palestinians who have a Gaza ID can go back to Gaza. So there are Palestinians who live in Egypt, for example, they cannot go back to Gaza because they do not have the Gaza ID. And they wanted to get married. They smuggled them through the tunnels. Grooms and brides.
I saw photos of people wedding dresses going through the tunnels.
Yes. And sometimes people would order KFC from Al Arish city, and they would get it. It's not hot enough, but they would get it through the tunnels. So there was a whole industry, but they were very risky. A lot of these tunnels collapsed, and a lot of people lost their lives. So these are the commercial tunnels that we knew. They were shut down in 2013 because of things that I don't want to talk about. It's politics in Egypt. They were shut down completely, almost completely. So any tunnel that exists today between Gaza and Egypt is a secret one, if any, of them remain.
Is there any like
No, these tunnels were never built by Israel. It was a Palestinian creation.
I think it means the one like under Al
So
Shifa.
Israel built some bunkers under specific institutions when they were in control of Gaza, including one under Shifa Hospital. And they have been saying, oh, Shifa, there is a tunnel, there is a command center, there is blah 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 blah. And then they went to the MRI device and they planted some AK-47 Kalashnikovs and say, oh, we found weapons. Where's the command center? It's the reason they wanted to take over Shifa. Two reasons. they wanted a victory picture that they drew over the months that we captured this place. They also wanted to depopulate because it's the biggest hospital. It was built by the British, and then the Egyptians expanded it when they controlled Gaza. Gaza was under Egyptian control for 20 years almost, and then the Israelis, and then it was expanded more and more under the Palestinian Authority and then Hamas. So they wanted to depopulate Gaza. If you cannot have access to medical care as a person, you wouldn't stay in that place. This is the main reason. They turned this hospital into a graveyard, literally. Hundreds of bodies were laid to rest in the
Compound.
in the field, like around in the compound, around the buildings. Some of these bodies were kidnapped by Israel, because again, this is a different story. They take organs, Palestinian body organs, and they give them to Israeli patients so that they survive. They also, conduct tests on Palestinians. They take the skin. This is a different story, but so this is the main reason they wanted to evacuate by force Ashifa hospital.
The future. Go to Egypt. Away from land. Or is it just you're sick of it, and this is the point time to get your voice across?
As Palestinians, although 70% of people in Gaza are refugees, but we have a very strong attachment to Gaza. And we say, even if you leave Gaza, Gaza doesn't leave you. Even if you leave and live elsewhere, you get another citizenship, you have access to everything. Gaza doesn't leave you. Gaza is a very unique place. So part of it is guilt, that you feel guilty, that you survived, but the rest of your people did not. But also a strong part of it is your love for the land. Our relationship with the land is not commercial. It's not deeds that we own the land. We belong to the land. So, and of course, you want to be with your family. You want to help your family, and this is your homeland. Even though the situation is terrible, there is a genocide in your land, but this is still your home. I don't know how you feel about your home, but for me, my home is my everything, like my family, my memories. I want to go back to my memories, to my family, because this is what defines me. Some people feel guilty. Some people feel sick. They want to leave and they don't want to come back at all. We're not superheroes, but the majority of people will stick to the land. As I said, 700,000 Palestinians chose to remain in North Gaza, although they know if they do not die by Israeli bombardment, they will die by starvation. But again, I don't want to become refugee again, because becoming a refugee, we know what that means. Especially, in the collective memory of Palestinians. A lot of Palestinians, Palestinians were not just, as Israel claims, they made the desert bloom. It was not a desert. It was never a desert. We had a nation, culture, we had factories, we had airports, we had radios, we had newspapers in different languages when no one in the Middle East did. And all of a sudden, you lose all of this, and many families owned land, and they were wealthy, and all of a sudden they became refugees with nothing, like a tent. They don't want to do that again. So what is the other option? Death? Okay, I will die in my own land with dignity, rather than having to be humiliated again and again by becoming a refugee. That's the equation. And then you have people, I don't know if this is a narrative here, but other parts of the world, they claim, oh, Palestinians sold their land, and that's why they're miserable and they deserve it, which is another Zionist lie. If Palestinians did, then why would they go back to death? Our relationship is not like deeds. Even like when we talk about the Palestinians who try to prove their ownership of the land by showing the deed to the land, which is great, the key to their house. But this is also a colonial document. Our relationship with the land goes beyond papers. We are part of the land. We belong to the land, and we will return to the land. The relationship with the land is very unique and special. It goes beyond bureaucracy. It goes beyond ownership. It's part of us.
Yes, with that, no other questions. Yeah, one more.
The urgency is there, but institution can be like the odds are stacked against Palestine because of the greed and capitalism just being devoid of, people in power devoid of humanity, right? And when we talk about ICC and all that, sometimes I think like we should be afraid that people are going to take a very long time and then will it be too late? So, what is the discussion about armed resistance? Is the only solution to free Palestine actually armed resistance? What do you think?
So throughout history, Palestinians have staged 14 non-violent intifadas, uprisings, major, from 1882 up until today. So the vast majority of resistance in Palestine throughout history was non-violent. What happened? Palestinians were crushed. International law gives Palestinians the right to use all means to liberate their land, including armed resistance. When you cage coaching a cat
Yeah.
in a
okay.
cage and not expect that this cat is going to scratch you, you're wrong. This is the least. Like even survivors of the Holocaust, they said, if we knew that we're going to die, at least we wanted to make sure that some of our jailers will die with us. So Palestinians have the right to use all means, including armed resistance. They tried nonviolent resistance, it didn't work. They've been trying nonviolent resistance in the West Bank, and Israel is just expanding. Settlements are expanding. I mean, Israel is not throwing flowers and roses on Palestinians in Gaza. They're throwing bombs. But then the international community is allowing this to happen. There is no no-fly zone over Gaza. They never do that. They will not do that. They do it elsewhere. The ICC acted in the case of Ukraine within 4 days, and other cases very quickly. Palestinians have been waiting for 6 years, although there are very clear crimes committed in Palestine, but it's also politicized. Why? Because the West owns the narrative. All these institutions, the UN system itself, were created by the most powerful that won the Second World War. So they shaped the international community, and they have had tremendous power and influence over these institutions, including the ICC. There are a lot of countries. Why do we have the veto at the UN Security Council? Why do some countries have the power of the veto? Why, when the General Assembly, UN General Assembly votes, 120 countries voted in favor of ceasefire? That's the majority of the so-called international community. The international community is not the West. But again, the way this system was designed is very at fault. We lost trust in the ICC and the international system. International law says Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza is illegal, but then they did not do anything to stop it. Even today, the UN, UNICEF, we feel that they're very complicit, and so they operate in line with Israel's orders and what Israel's wishes. And as long as we have the power of the veto, there will be one country in the world that supports Israel to the core, is the United States. They will veto any resolution that brings peace to Palestinians. So what do? We have many countries that support Palestinians. We have to be on the streets, I think, forever until Palestine is free. There are, many targets. We can do a lot of things. We can use social media. We can make some noise. Palestinian novelist شو اسمه غسان كنفاني, who wrote Men in the Sun, says, who lived in Gaza as a refugee, by the way, for 1 year in Shija'iyya, 1948, 1949. He said, we have to knock on the walls of the tank. He said, I wish, speaking of 3 Palestinians who died inside a tank while they tried to cross to Kuwait in the Iraqi desert at the border, said, I wish if they knocked on the walls of the tank, but they chose not to. Otherwise, the driver who helped them to cross would be captured. So we have to make some noise, as Malcolm X says. He says, early in life, I learned that in order to get some cheese, I needed to make some noise. His siblings were very quiet. They never got their mom's cheese. But going to school, because they were poor, he had to make some noise. We have to make some noise. Now, a lot of Israelis do not say they're Israelis. They're afraid because they feel ashamed. They cannot, people in the world, a lot of people, especially young people, even in the US itself, even American Jews, who I know a lot of them, they're not happy with Israel the way it is now. So making more noise, and I think being on the street, pressure will only force governments. A lot of governments that speak of human rights now, we've seen their masks falling off. These are the same countries that supported South Africa, apartheid South Africa, until the very end. They will not come and say, we were mistaken, because if they say so, it means they condemn themselves, because a lot of these countries are post-settler colonial countries, Canada, the US, and other countries. So they see Israel in themselves, and they see themselves in Israel. They will not say, Palestinians have the right to exist. They will not come and say that, but they will be forced to do that if Israeli consulates and embassies are shut down and people are on the street. If people are striking and boycotting, creating economic pressure on these governments and political pressure, they will say yes, because their interests will be at risk, not because they care about the lives of Palestinians.
Actually, one thing is actually to reclaim the Palestinian narrative. Like Edward Said was saying, permission to narrate has to be given to the Palestinians. And that's what these books, why Yusuf and I did these books, is because we're giving Palestinians a voice. All these stories are from the mouths of the prisoners themselves. And the prisoners are actually just part of every Palestinian family as well. So like today's event as well, it's about Yusuf giving the Palestinian narrative. So we hope that more and more people will listen and look for Palestinian voices rather than just listen to the Western ones. Yusuf has just also started a podcast called One World, One Struggle, Palcast. You can find it on Spotify and Apple, something.
Yes. Well,
yes. So listen to it twice a week. It comes out. Yusuf speaks to all kinds of people, as well as discuss all Palestinian issues. So thank you very much for attending, and I hope you did gain something from this.
Thank you.